Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stephanie Michelle, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode.
Hi everyone and welcome to this episode of the podcast. I am Sarah and as always I'm here with Stef, and this week we're going to be talking about how to handle family, relatives, holidays. This episode is coming out where it's Thanksgiving in the US, and I know we have quite a few listeners that are over there, but this is something I think that affects many of us a lot of the time. Food is not something that exists just in isolation. There's so much around family dynamics, not just food, but body image as well, and having to manage comments from family members. And the very hardest place to enforce your boundaries has got to be with family members. Am I right?
I think it all the time. It's still one of the hardest things for me because I still have to continue to do it. And not just like me stating my boundaries to my family, but me protecting my own, like my internal sense of what I let in. I think it's that part for me that at this point is still something I have to consciously do. And kind of prepare myself going in, because I know, there's family dynamics that exist and they always will. And there's a role that my family sees me as playing. And I think this is not just me, of course, this is true for all of us. We all have these different roles and ways of connecting with one another. And I don't know, it's one of these things that seems like it never goes away. It's not like you ever really get to a place, at least I haven't, where my boundaries have been asserted and then that's what they are, and moving forward everything's good now. It's ongoing all the time. There's lots of repetition and reminding, but I have to remind myself to not let certain things soak into me and to kind of get back into my own center, because I can do that most of the time in my day-to-day, but when I return back to my family, it's hard. There's certain ways I revert right back to ways that I was in before. And that's not to blame anyone else. It's just the role that I assume around certain people. It's the dynamic that just seems to exist. It's so embedded. So yeah, I think that it's something that's not uncommon to have to keep working at and to have difficulty with.
I agree. But, done. Let's wrap up there.
Ooh. Yeah. What's it like for you? I mean, what is it like with you and your family dynamics?
I think it's amazing how out in the big wide world, I can feel like a grown up, yet with family, all it can take is a withering look to reduce me to feeling like a little kid again. And it's extraordinary how, we use that word triggering a lot, right? How you can get triggered, or sometimes we describe it in therapy as being rubber banded back into feeling exactly like you did as a kid. When you grew up, your caregivers, they were the powerful figures in your life, and how they saw you impacted how you started to see yourself. You just can't but do that. And I think what happens with families, and why family dynamics are the hardest of all to change, is that we have these stories about people. So when you are born, there's a whole story around your birth and how wanted you were and what your parents expected of you and whether you lived up to them. And then as the years go on, those stories don't necessarily evolve that much. So your family still see you through that same story. So you can go out into the world and you can be this incredible, successful person by worldly standards. And the way that your parents or your family, other family members see you is very different. And it's really difficult to be seen through that story, but it's the same the other way around as well. So there'll be things that I'll throw it out to you. I'm sure there are things that let's take your father as an example, could say to you that if somebody else said the exact same thing to you would be a very different experience than your father being the one who said it to you. And that's because of projection. That's because of the story you have about your father, and he has a story about you too. And that's what's difficult about families. It's really difficult to change these very long entrenched stories that we have about people, and it's difficult to tolerate the story they have about us.
Yes. I think it's important to note that it goes both ways because it's something I have to humble myself, and remind myself too, because there's so many ways in which I'm like, well, you made me like this, and this is the box you put me in, and this is how, this is why I felt the way I feel about myself for so long, and now I don't. And then it's like, well, also this goes both ways because I noticed myself doing it too, like sort of categorizing the way that I was brought up, or my parents' personalities, and my siblings. I have a brother and a sister as well, and they're both younger than me, and there's certain ways I think of them. And so for as much as they trigger me, I am sure I fully own that I probably trigger them as well, and that whole dynamic sets everyone up with a certain amount of tension when you don't live together anymore and you come back together. And I know that when we all come back together, we're all sort of holding our breath in some ways, in some respects, about how is this person going to make me feel today? What are they going to say? And that's existing all around, and to sort of see that as part of what family dynamics are, and that it's about navigating the way that you can protect yourself now, knowing all of that and taking the space. For me, my family has like a central meeting point that we get together on holidays. My parents live near me, a couple hours away, and my brother and my sister come, and all our families come. We stay in the same house together for at least a long weekend every holiday. I mean, this is not even just the holidays, but like, 4th of July here, and Labor Day and Memorial Day. So it's several times a year. And we grew up, and I always thought we were just a really close family. Um, that was the word that I used. And I was proud of that too. I thought we were close and real because we said anything to one another that crossed our minds, and we spoke our minds to each other, basically. Later come to realize this closeness was more of lack of boundaries, and that some of the ways in which I had kind of identified as like connecting with people was really not having boundaries with people. And so this is something that I've been navigating myself since my recovery, because that was the time where I started to realize that, I'm not really comfortable with people saying certain things to me, and like kind of openly judging me in this way that I have always assumed was closeness, but it's actually not. That's not what that is. And realizing that I just kind of changed the whole way I connected to my family. And it was hard because I felt like it was taking away closeness by setting boundaries. I thought that the more that I was saying that I needed, someone to respect not speaking about certain things to me, or not feeling free to comment on either the way I looked, or the things I said, or the food I was eating, or who I was, like that wasn't a violation of our connection, but it was actually a protection of it. And seeing it that way was really difficult for my family to accept, because to them, this was like, well, why are you withdrawing? Why can't we talk? It wasn't met with openness necessarily. But I stuck to it because it was what was going to preserve my mental health. And I don't know that I would have gotten there if it wasn't such a drastic thing, that in this recovery process where I did have to say, I can't have you saying these things. I can't have you judging my food. I can't have you, please respect that where I'm at. If it wasn't such a kind of a drastic thing I was in the middle of, I don't know that I would have necessarily needed to set boundaries, and therefore I wouldn't have set them, or I wouldn't have recognized that I needed to. So for me now, it's been just this ongoing process of maintaining that, and making sure that I don't slip back into that old familiar habit of which I do, by the way. Like when we get together, I find myself, sometimes getting close that way, and not maintaining the separation in certain ways. But that's the way that I've been that in my context of my personal life, that's how it's been showing up for me. And I know that this is a hard place for people when they're just starting it. And how do you even begin to set boundaries when it's not something you're used to doing, or it's not something your family's expecting you to do?
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting to me because I feel like you and I have lived opposite lives in some ways, and in other ways, just so much resonance. I think for me, family-wise, the opposite. Things didn't get spoken about. People don't say what they think. My brother's he's more introverted by nature. We get on well, but he's quite private, I think, and I don't really know what he really thinks and feels about stuff. And my mum died 11 years ago, and my dad and I did not have an easy relationship, but we've, really, since my mum passing, my sense of it is that we've both really tried. That's how I feel it. We've never talked about that, but that's my interpretation of what's happened. And it feels a little bit like we kind of dance around each other a bit without really either of us particularly saying what we really think. And so, yeah, it's so interesting to me, this idea of people just saying what they think. And I've got a friend who's become a really close friend of mine, but we've only been friends less than a year and a half. And she's another therapist. And one of the things I find so refreshing about her is that she says what she thinks, not in this sort of brutal, I'm going to say what I think, and, to hell what anybody else thinks about that. But more, if something bothers her, she'll just say, like, this is bothering me. And when you said that, like, this is what I felt about that. And it's so refreshing. And I feel so safe in that friendship, because I know that if I do anything that really bothers her, she's going to say something. And I found that a lot of my friendships and relationships in the past haven't had that. And that it's interesting how we create these dynamics, right? Quite often we co-create these dynamics. So there can be an element of what's my part in that, in terms of how honest I am, how honest others are with me about what they really think and feel. Because I think it's not been my experience.
It's mine. I mean, I can't not say, I guess, what I think, but I think there's a difference between being authentic and saying what you think and saying what you judge, and the way that can come across differently. And maybe that's part of it. Maybe, and see, even as I'm sitting here talking about it, it's like, well, yeah, I guess I'm throwing the lens of that it's bad, or that saying what you think is bad because that's the way I've categorized it because of the ways it has hurt. But it may be more of the ways that the judgment shows up and the way that is freely expressed, rather than the communication factor of, there is an element of good communication. It's just maybe could work on the execution a little. But yeah, it's interesting. And I think it's good that we both have these different experiences in this, for this topic in particular, because I find that with clients and followers that I speak to who ask about how do I set boundaries, it seems to be one or the other, where people are coming from a place of enmeshed family dynamics, or I don't feel free to, like, we don't talk about things like this. This is extremely vulnerable. And it's interesting to me because I don't have that experience of your side of it. And so for me, it's interesting to hear and to learn about how we can maybe both talk about, like, how in the context of food and body image, how did boundaries, or how did navigating being with family show up during that process, and now with your family and with mine, and how did we both navigate this differently, so that maybe we could help other people, if you resonate with either side of this story.
Yeah, and I think my family talk a lot about food and weight, but it's always at the eye level. They talk about themselves. So I don't think my dad has ever said a word to me about my body or about my food choices. No judgment. I feel like, I suppose almost that he's not really interested in that side of things, which is fine, and that's
great.
That's the preferable side of things, right? And I also find that in my life, and it's been really interesting since starting this work, I think in the last few weeks, about 4 people have started to say something about, like, their body or their dieting, and they'll go, I know I'm not supposed to say that to you, and I know I shouldn't really be doing this. I'm like, do what you want, like, I don't mind, like, it doesn't. I'm okay with that. I think because what I saw and my experience in the family was that people just seemed to take on their own stuff. It wasn't pushed on to me. That was how I felt about it. I think I'm less vulnerable to feeling triggered by other people doing the same. So even somebody in a smaller body than mine complaining that they feel fat or something like that, which I know a lot of people find really difficult in that position to deal with that. I think I know it's not about me because I was never told it was about me when I was in a young formative age. But if you've grown up and it is told about, people's own body insecurities is then pushed onto you and what you should be insecure about, though that's going to be a much harder position to be in.
Yeah. Well, for me, I feel like that was my experience because my my father's body image was projected to us. And we absorbed it. And so for me, when I did get really bothered by statements like that, like when someone in a smaller body than me would complain about their body size, that really pissed me off. Like I really was like, that's how, also just can't you see, like, I do understand that it's not even about the body size. I can see that and I understand that, but there was something about it that felt very off-putting to me, and that is because I had a sensitivity of my body being wrong. That message that came across to me. So that's interesting to see how, like, yeah, the fundamental way that you think of your body from a young age or from your family's messaging can have this domino effect of how you're navigating it now. Well, of course it does. But did your family even know that you struggled with food? And as you were recovering, were they aware of that? And how did you protect yourself? Or did you not have to? Because if it wasn't talked about, then maybe you didn't feel like you had to.
I told them about it, and pretty much from straight away, because it was so sudden for me, as I've talked about in episode 1 and other points. It was so sudden. It seemed so I say out of character, but just so far beyond my experience. I'd never struggled with anything like this. And here I am in my mid-20s, like literally not being able to manage this intense, ravenous appetite that was controlling me. And I can remember one time I was at my parents' house, and at the beginning there was a lot of nighttime eating going along. So I would get up in the middle of the night. And this wasn't getting up in the middle of the night, but I think it was quite late. I think my dad must have been in his office. And I remember sneaking downstairs because I was compelled to go and eat something. And I don't remember what I picked up. But I remember Dad coming out of the lounge and catching me, which is every person's worst nightmare in the middle of a binge. The shame. Oy. And I remember him like coming up to me, and I remember him taking whatever it was out of my hands. And but what struck me about it is that he did it. My dad has the capacity for gentleness, but I wouldn't describe him as a gentle person. But he did it so gently because he knew how distressed I was about this, because I had been talking about it. It didn't feel like a, oh no, you don't. It was like a, come on now. And I can remember this relief. Actually, oh gosh, I feel like crying when I say this. I remember this relief coming through me that he took it away from me, because I was so out of control at that point that it was like the decision was taken out of my hands. He took it from me, and I didn't have to wrestle with that part of me anymore, and I could go back to bed. And so I did. And that's like the only time I can remember, like, anyone in my family kind of getting involved in my food decisions and kind of saying no without really saying no. I don't even remember what he said. He didn't say much. He just took it off me. But I remember that he seemed concerned, not annoyed, not judgmental or anything like that. But it wasn't talked about. But then I had spoken about it. And I think I've told my dad off in the past, because I'll be like, I have a whole conversation with you and you don't ask how I am. And he'll say, I just assume that you will tell me how you are. I don't expect to have to ask you these questions. We're having a conversation. Tell me how you are. And I think that was the family message, was about you say what you want to say, but almost like a don't pry kind of situation. I think in many ways I'm grateful for, because there are advantages to that, but like anything, there are also disadvantages, because sometimes you need someone to come and find you. You're not ready to come out and say, hey, this is what's going on.
That's interesting. That makes me understand that story. Because I'm thinking if that same thing had happened to me, if my dad had taken food out of my hands, it would have been a completely different experience. But the fact that you wanted that parental intervention of somebody coming into your space and saying, I care and I'm trying to help you, or I don't know, it's just that almost it's the opposite. It's like the boundary that you're asking, to let in versus one that you're saying keep out, because it wasn't the norm for you to have that space be, not invaded is the wrong word, but have that space be moved closer. Whereas for me, it was more of an issue of like, please give me my space. So that's such an interesting way of looking at the same experience and seeing how that could be differently interpreted and needed or not needed. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about when we're navigating boundaries in general and thinking of how a family member is intending something to sound, or this, is it supportive, but because of a past history, it feels not supportive, and sort of looking at it through different lenses like that. Because I can, there were things that my mother has said to me and still says to me sometimes about food that come from a compassionate place. But because I've got a history of something else, it feels like not that. And so I automatically interpret it in this negative light, and it's perhaps not something that is actually there. Yeah, I think there's also the idea of being the identified patient in the family. For me, my food issues were apparent from the time I was, well, I would say 15, but even before that, I think I was starting to get obsessed before that. And I was just the one in the family who struggled with food openly, and everyone knew, and body as well. I mean, it's the way that I became known. And so that was actually a different element of navigating being with my family, because I was changing that definition of myself. In effect, I was saying, like, I'm leaving this behind. I'm trying to get away from being the one who struggles with food and the one who hates her body. It was really kind of part of my safety blanket, because in my house, it was like, I was the one who like I always had a different meal, and people expected me to. People would cook around me. People would buy things and be like, don't show that to Stef because she won't approve. Or nobody could comment on anything I was wearing. Like, people learned how to not say things to me, and then would passively aggressively say them to me. And then somebody else would say, like, you can't say that to her. And it was just it was like another person in the room. It was like this presence of being that person. And when I was trying to move away from that, it was really difficult for me to remind people, like, that's not who I was. Like, and it was like, I don't know, because as I stopped being such a clean eater, and stopped judging other people for what they were eating, I had to remind people, it's okay. You don't have to hide that from me. You don't have to pretend that, the food doesn't have this much oil in it, or whatever it was. That was like an old one that my mom never forgot about. And she always would be like, it doesn't have that much oil. And I'd be like, I've been over that since the 90s. But it's one of those things where identity, I think, becomes wrapped up sometimes in who you are with your family, and like that part of your identity becomes all you are maybe known for or seen as in your family. And so the process of being with your family during recovery becomes about showing people who you are outside of that definition. And sometimes I think people don't know how to relate to you if that's not the thing, especially if it has been for a really, really long time. And it feels really vulnerable, and it can be frustrating because people will continue to go back to that story about you all the time. And you sort of have to reroute everybody back to, no, like, that's not where I am right now. And that's not who I am. But sometimes that's the pattern of relating to you, and being in your family itself is based on that. It revolves around that. And sometimes people need that. I think that sometimes the family depends on you being in that role, being the one to blame on, or the one who struggles with mental health. Like, that's your role. So everything can get projected onto you, and to be reasserting, like, no, that's not the way that I want to be treated, or you're projecting something onto me that isn't mine.
We just want to grab a moment of your time to let you know that we are now on YouTube. So if you can't wait for the next episode, we are going to be uploading the podcast onto our YouTube channel a day early. So please head over there and subscribe. We are Life After Diets Podcast on YouTube and on Instagram, and you can email the show lifeafterdietspodcast@gmail.com.
And if you're interested in working with me, Stephanie, I work with clients one-to-one, and I also am enrolling for a group program to work on intuitive eating foundations with a binge and emotional eating recovery lens. You can apply at www.imstephaniemichelle.com/application.
And if you want to connect with me, Sarah, I am the Binge Eating Therapist on Instagram and YouTube, and my website is thebingeeatingtherapist.com. Now let's get back to the episode.
These types of things started to come up for me a lot during my recovery process because I started to say them. I started to not just take for granted that I was the sick one. And I didn't just blindly absorb all of these sort of passive aggressive judgments of me. And I started to say out loud, like, no, that's not mine. That's not me. That's not who I am. And that's not for you to say about me. So all of that was really difficult on top of an already difficult process of trying to just like stay within myself and stay grounded in my own center, and to just be fielding all of these other comments and judgments that I was assuming and feeling and hearing going on around me. Making, I think, things like holiday time really difficult because it's just like you can't get away. It's just, there's a lot of pressure internally already. And then on the external side with family members saying things and doing things, and you being reminded and seeing yourself, mirrored back by them. And it's just really frustrating. And I think it can be really overwhelming. So all of that to say that one of the things that I did, and one of the things that I continued to do as I was dealing with that, was to take more space. So I wasn't in the practice of leaving the room or giving myself time away from my family when I was around them. I was used to being like, again, we were all like together, like in each other's business all the time. And I started to intentionally retreat. And I would just say, like, give myself just space in my own room. And I would tell my husband and my kids, like, I'll be out in 10 minutes. And I would just get away, and I would just sort of like remind myself of who I was, rather than getting absorbed in the thick of who my family thought I was, which is so easy to do in their presence. And I would just use that technique a lot periodically, every couple of hours, as I found myself in the midst of that, of that experience.
And did you get pushback on that? Taking that time?
So not always, but sometimes it was. I've also mentioned before, I have a history of depression. So for a lot of my life, when I lived with my family in the house, I retreated because I was depressed. And now I think about it, maybe I retreated because I needed my own space. But it was sort of, that was my story. It was like Stef's depressed. She's on her own again. And this was a completely different way of doing that. And I did get pushback of like, well, you disappeared. You just retreat. I mean, I hear that a lot. And it's like, I have to internally set my own boundary of not absorbing that as a shameful thing, and of recognizing I'm doing that for my self-preservation. Like, this is a self-care tool. This is not a problem. And it's funny because I say that and it's like, yeah, obviously, like intellectually that makes perfect sense. But in my emotions, I'm like, there's just like a part of me that's like, is it though? Like it's just like that insecurity. And I have to really get in my head. And that's why I need to be alone and to be like, no. Like, this is how you breathe. Like, this is how you pull yourself away from the vortex of, that family identity stuff. Like that's it is a way of taking care of yourself. I think that it always has been, to be honest. And for me to redefine that, it's important that I do it inside of me first, so that the pushback can be met with my own like wise mind, instead of, the pushback being met with, oh no, is she right? Oh yeah, that must be true. I must be, because it's so easy to believe the judgments coming at you, or just, what people are saying in the pushback itself. But for me, I have a practice now of centering when I'm with family much more often. I don't do it when I'm home. I probably should, but I don't, like having an actual grounding, centering practice. But when I'm with my family, I do, and it's intentional, and I have to have it there so that I can field all of that stuff.
Mm-hmm. I think whenever I'm working with someone who's struggling with boundaries, often family come up and talking about how to put them in. And I'll be like, no, if boundaries are difficult for you, I don't think family is the first place to practice them. There's so many opportunities in the world where we're a bit more in our adult, and that's the time to. And I think it's near impossible to even figure out what boundaries you want to put in until you ask yourself that question, what is it that I want, or what is it that I need? And so many people struggle with even being able to answer that question. Their mind goes, I don't know. I don't actually know what I want. I've been told what I should want, and I don't know what I need. I've just been giving and giving and giving all the time. When it comes to putting in boundaries, yes, family, I think, is one of the most important places to have it. But if this is a pattern in somebody's entire life, don't run before you can crawl, I would say. But when it comes to family and food, on my dad's side of the family, because my dad's Indian, and in the Indian culture, food is love. Like there's no separating that. And giving food is such a sign of love and respect. And it's really disrespectful not to. When I went to India and I was with my aunt and we would go and visit sort of this long distance relatives, you will really offend people if you don't eat the food that you're given. We will really offend people. And I didn't want to embarrass my aunt. And so these foods are being brought around and I'm eating these foods that I'm not enjoying. Looking back on that as a one-off, when I'm visiting these people who I'm probably not going to see again, I'm okay with that. But when I go and visit my aunt, it's this battle all the time. She gets upset with me because I just want to drink water, because during the day that's all I want to drink, and she wants me to have something else and I don't. And we've really pushed against each other on this, and I've said to her, why are you trying to get me to drink something that I would enjoy less than a glass of water? And she just shakes her head. She goes, well, you're strange. And I'm just like, okay. But it's so interesting. And when you leave, she will always send you away with food. She's already fed you, but you have to, and she'll go and find things from the cupboard to give to you, to take away. When you've had the experience of being in those environments, particularly with family, where food is being pushed upon you and there is a responsibility and obligation on you to say yes to make the other person feel okay, that's where I think practicing our no and asking, do I really want this thing? Because binging, for example, feels like it takes away choice. It doesn't feel like you're choosing, you're compelled to. Dieting takes away choice because you follow the rules. And food freedom, the whole thing that I see what you and I talk about, is about finding choice and about having the freedom to say yes and no to food.
Yeah. Well, it's also about in so doing, I think, especially if you're like people pleasing mentality, right? That you feel ashamed of saying no, or you feel wrong. Like it makes you feel like you're doing something wrong to say no. And it's the practice of mentally wrapping your head around the fact slowly that it's not wrong. And that goes against cultural or generational ideas of what is maybe polite, or, or maybe it's seen as like accepting love and that you're rejecting that somehow. Mm-hmm. But sort of in your making peace with this internally and sort of understanding like it's okay for me to say no. It's okay for me to be full. It's okay for me to set my boundary. And I think it's that mental piece of yourself that makes it so hard to actually say no, because when I come from an Italian family where also food is love and very much like constantly given. And I remember I did not find it easy to say no to anything. I was like, yes, of course. Like I was very compliant as a child. And the first time that I did learn to say no, I mean, unfortunately, was as my eating disorder grew, my restrictive eating disorder, and I simply wouldn't allow myself to eat food that my grandma would constantly, it pained her that I was not eating, but I forced myself to say no because, I didn't want to be eating at that time. So I learned then how to do it, but I never learned how to do it without feeling bad, so I learned the no part, but I didn't learn how to stop internalizing the guilt. So now that has been the part for me where, I mean, I can say no. I know how to do that. And I know how to stand firm in my no's. But now for me, it's the part about releasing any stories that I have that I'm telling myself about that. But for someone who hasn't practiced no at all, and I'm curious to hear because you alluded earlier to saying like starting with family isn't the best place to start. It's like running before you can crawl. So what are examples of ways that practicing more mild boundary setting might be applicable to someone's life? Like where are areas that you would suggest to start trying that practice?
Mm-hmm. As I mentioned before, being able to to sit with that question, what do I want? What do I need? And sometimes the answer is going to be, I don't know. And sometimes to find that answer, we find out what we don't want first. So when you say yes to something, or when you allow someone to behave in a way that afterwards you don't feel good about, that's the opportunity to go back and reflect. I often ask people to start by, rather than trying to actually put the boundary in place without even being able to imagine what that is that you want. If I'm thinking of some of the common ones, it might be for a friend or for somebody not to comment on your body, or not to talk about certain things that you find triggering. That might be the first place to start for somebody. I'm just thinking of a common scenario. How I encourage people to do this is, when you ask somebody who is someone important in your life, someone who cares about you, a friend or something like that, when you ask them to do something for you and you're appreciative about their willingness to do it, people usually want to do it. If they don't, that's probably a red flag. Let's say you make some comment to me about weight loss or something like that. And it involves being a little bit vulnerable as well, in order for someone to be able to connect to what it is. Because the minute somebody feels like you're attacking them, you're going to get their defenses. So you have to be vulnerable first, so that it's not an attack on them. So if you said something about weight, I might say, I'm doing some work around this for me, because I've got a lot of feelings around my weight, whatever it might be, a tiny bit of self-disclosure, whatever feels safe. And what would be really supportive for me is actually if you could not talk about that around me. Is that something you're willing to do? Always adding on the end a question, because we cannot police or force people to behave differently around us. We're asking for their cooperation. And so if we want them to cooperate, and we want them to want to cooperate, they need to understand why that is. And there are some people that are always likely to be dismissive and not understand it. And even if you preface it with you don't need to understand this, but this is what I feel like I need right now. This would really help me if you would be willing to do this. Are you willing? Very few people in that position are just going to go, no, I'm not willing to not talk about that one thing around you.
I actually found it much easier to write a letter to certain people, and not even a letter. That's a little bit formal. I wrote an email to people in my life about this topic, because it just felt easier to me. And that was a way that I learned how to step into boundary setting, because it was not quite as vulnerable and it didn't feel as confrontational to me as, not that confrontation is bad, by the way. But that it was a way for me to get my thoughts on paper, because figuring out what I want, to respond to that question of figuring out what you want, sometimes I don't know that until I really I don't know that in the moment. I guess, especially around certain people, my emotions are so high that I can't think straight. And when I write something down, there's more of a clear head, and I write it, and usually it comes out. Whatever it is I need, I didn't even know I needed. It's like out, and that's how I process anyway. So for me, writing something down was a way that I could identify what my needs were. I could state where I was without letting the vulnerability perhaps get in my own way. And because it's easier for me to be vulnerable there. And then to ask for what I needed, or in fact, I don't think I asked. I think I stated, like, this is where I'm at. Maybe I said, like, I need you to respect where I'm at, and to not make these comments, and I'm doing what's best for me, and I know what's best for me. I just asked for the respect, and I did that via email with certain people close, in my life. And for me, it felt safe, and it was respected. And in fact, I got replies to that email that I wasn't expecting. That felt really nice. It felt like it was received and heard. And I remember getting teary at what my dad wrote back to me, that I'm not sure the same thing would have happened in a personal conversation, because I know that would have escalated. I don't know, but I suspect that would have escalated into a conversation that was more, where he might have said something back that I would have been like, oh, but because, like, there's just like interpretations of what people say. And it might have gotten, which is often how our conversations go, because there's like one comment in there. Whereas the writing was a bit different. So that was a way that I learned how to boundary set I've had clients too who've used that technique with like their in-laws, for example, where I have a client whose in-laws were people who made lots of comments about weight and body size and diets. And she felt very vulnerable to say to them, I struggle with binge eating and I'm working on my recovery. Like she just said, I can't say it into them, but I can write it down. So she did. And she wrote them this email before they came to visit, and it was okay. They received it, and they actually, it was one of those responses that went over really well. And the whole visit was free of that talk. And she was like, the relief, I mean, she still had a lot of anxiety leading up, but it actually ended up being okay. Yeah, just as another way of perhaps dealing with that and preemptively stating what you need prior to going in.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that gets said a lot with boundary setting is no is a complete sentence. Don't over explain yourself. And that is really hard for a people pleaser. And I do it all the time. And it's something I'm quite conscious of. And when I catch myself, I pull myself back, but I don't always catch myself till afterwards. I over explain because I want people to really get it. I want people to know that I really would if I could. And I just, but to be able to say no. So if somebody's pushing something on you, let's say it's a food situation and they're trying to give you something that you don't want, just say, no, thank you. And then they'll say, go on, no, go on, just have the last bit. And then it'll be, I don't want it. And I've been pushed. I've tried this out before, and I've been pushed, and I've said twice, I don't want it. And then when I was pushed again, I turned it around and I said, why are you trying to get me to have something I don't want? I'm not going to enjoy it. And they had nothing. And then they backed off at that point. But and they call it the broken record, where you just say the same thing over and over again. I know that can feel a bit confrontational in the way that you do it. And in some situations, it's quite tricky to do that. But then to turn it around and kind of say, like, why is this so important to you?
Yeah. Yes, the broken record technique is effective. It feels a little odd, but I also there's someone on Instagram called the Confrontationist whose specialty is actually learning how to be confrontational and how it's not a bad thing. It's simply communicating with someone. And the way that she frames confrontation is so different than we think of it, like the associations of that word being like it's a bad thing. And in fact, it being how we communicate our needs with someone else. How else are they going to know? It's just interesting to think of it like that, as that reframe too. But I also think it's worth mentioning, just before we wrap up, that around holidays or around family, emotions run higher, and that can sometimes feel like the reason why food and body image issues escalate to begin with. And maybe someone, I'm thinking of when I was with my family, I would binge more. Oh gosh, I would binge so much more in my parents' kitchen than anywhere else, really. I think some of my biggest binges were there. And recognizing that's a very, really difficult thing to navigate too, is this tendency to like think of being with family as a time where your triggers are more likely to be happening, and also the vulnerability to binge or engage in other disordered behaviors and to hate your body, or to like feel like not at home in your own skin is those things are running higher. So ways of again, like using a centering technique or stating your boundaries. Like that's why boundaries I think are important, is because we are more sensitive during those times, and that navigating food and body image issues around family is almost like expecting that that's going to be a bit more difficult. So there's going to be a need for a little bit more sensitivity with self during those times, and that proceeding as normal may not work as well. The tactics you're usually using that you might, for me anyway, I just anticipate that these times are harder, not with food anymore necessarily, but just with just different thoughts that come up and things like that. And just to recognize when I'm moving through it, to not identify with it then so much and be like, yes, I'm with my family, and this is why this is happening. And I can sort of like see it happening on a stage rather than me being like inside of it. Cause it's really easy to get inside of it when your emotions are like on and you're just like, just give me the food and just give me the food to numb this out or whatever. To see it like, this is a response I'm having, navigate it a little bit differently.
And before we get into any takeaways, it might be an opportunity to remind our listeners that they can come and meet us in December if they want to. On the 19th of December, we are going to be doing an online live Q&A for our community, because we love connecting with you guys and want to actually be able to talk with you as well.
And that link is in the show notes. We would love to have you and hear your stories and be able to talk back and forth about the personal experiences going on in your lives.
From today's episode, what would you like people to take away? For me, I think to remind people that families are the most triggering things in the whole wide world. So if you find yourself feeling triggered when you're with family and it's difficult for you to be around family, I think there's a tendency to feel guilty about that, because there's this, this cultural ideal image, like we have with body image, this ideal body image, this ideal image of what a family should be like and what closeness looks like and all of that. And families are much more complicated. And if you are someone who is trying to figure out your boundaries and you're navigating this path and your level of tolerance for other people's comments around food and body image, to be gentle with yourself and take some time to think about that and figure it out. And remember that I think people sometimes feel like they don't deserve to put their needs first, almost like they don't deserve protection, because that's what boundaries are. They're to protect and come from a place of self-care. And when you were first talking about you saying no, learning to say no, it sounds like you learned to say no from a place of fear because you were in that restricted state. But you found a no, and then the intention behind the no changed. Mm-hmm. And fear is a very good motivator, but self-care, I think for a lot of people, a lot of our listeners, that sometimes doesn't feel strong enough to push you into a place that's that uncomfortable, because putting these things in place is uncomfortable.
My takeaway, or one of the things I want to drive home, is I think when we're in the presence of family, sometimes there's a susceptibility of forgetting who we are and leaning back into the stories. And I think it's an intentional practice of taking the space and time apart, if need be, to recenter and to recognize when are you responding to a story and when are you feeling more authentically you, and then learning how to stand there, which is maybe something that you haven't been able to practice thus far. I mean, for me, that certainly was the case. So it was a learned practice of remembering who I was in my identity now versus in the stories, and then not buying into those. And I picture it like a dog on a leash. Like you just keep bringing it back to the center, like just get back to the middle, like not being pulled around this way and that way. For me, that visualization like brings me back, and I have to do it over and over. Yeah.
And I would just leave people with encouraging them to ask themselves, what do I need? And am I willing to ask for it? And just sitting with that and the discomfort that might bring, the not knowing and the part of you that doesn't feel like maybe you deserve to ask, or that maybe sometimes it feels like people should just know. I think that's the frustrating part, is it feels like people should intuitively get this, and sometimes they don't. And then that's kind of back on us to figure out how we want to respond to that, and taking those first steps to looking after ourselves.
Yeah. All right, Sarah, thanks again for having me. Nope.
Having
me.
Indeed.
Did you get tired?
No, I kind of went into this, we need to do the how to contact the show bit. And then I was like, no, we don't, because we insert the thing in the middle. We don't need to do that.
Oh, right.
Or do we? No, we do normally say the bit in the middle. Is that just about working with us, or is that also about how to contact?
Yeah, you're right. It is. You're right. We got to say that.
So let me start again.
Let me start again.
Okay.
All right, Sarah. Well, thanks for another fun episode. Nope. No. All right, Sarah.
Not fun.
Thank you for. Okay. On that note, thank you for being with me, Sarah, and thanks everyone for joining us. If you'd like to reach us, we are Life After Diets Podcast at gmail.com, or you can find us on Instagram at Life After Diets Podcast. And I will see you again next week, Sarah.
See you next week.